call me the hunter. That's my name. Pretty young thing like you is my only game. Don't use no love gun, yeah! Don't need no kissing. When I get a hold of you, honey, gonna light you up like Christmas. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases, and then attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. And my humble opinion is that Kraven the Hunter sucks. Alright, I'm gonna wrap it up there. If you enjoyed this video, please give a like, share, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time. God damn it. Okay, so I saw Kraven the Hunter. This is the latest major action tentpole release by Sony Pictures in their so-called Sony's Spider-Man universe. For those who don't know, or if you are a saner quality of adult, if you don't care, though Spider-Man and his affiliated characters are intellectual properties of Marvel Entertainment, which is a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, Sony Pictures still owns the film adaptation rights to Spider-Man. And while in the last 6 or so years, Sony has entered into a very lucrative property sharing agreement with Disney, letting them use Spider-Man in their own Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the same amount of time, Sony has basically been going full speed ahead on their own cinematic universe, in which they're basically going through the rogues gallery of Spider-Man villains and supporting characters for their own set of interconnected standalone movies. This is something that they had been planning on doing as far back as 2013, but they kind of retired those plans when Amazing Spider-Man 2 turned out to be a financial disappointment. But there's no doubt in my mind that seeing how much, say, Warner Brothers has been having relatively stable success with franchises like Suicide Squad and the Harley Quinn show, as well as Todd Phillips raved about Joker movies, to say nothing of Disney's own pattern of success with more off-the-grid anti-hero characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy and Deadpool. There's no doubt in my mind that basically supercharged Sony's own enterprising idea to try to feed off the goodwill that international consumers have been giving to the Marvel Cinematic Universe for the better part of over a decade now, but build up their own house brand of weirder, more fringe kinds of superhero flicks, beginning in earnest with the success of Venom, starring Tom Hardy in 2018. But aside from the 3 Venom films, all of which did pretty dang well, of the 3 other anti-hero villain movies that Sony has made in just the last 2 years, with 3 of them coming out in this year alone, like, I'm sorry, that's too many movies in one franchise coming out within just a year of each other, and especially when there seems to be a pretty consistent trend right now of people just kind of falling out of love with the big comic book superhero tentpoles in general. You're already oversaturating your attempt at your own distinct brand in an already oversaturated market. That's just not good branding or financial strategy. Shows a real vacuum of creative leadership. But besides 3 Venom films, we've had a film based on Morbius, who's kind of a sci-fi mad science spin on a vampire. You also had Madam Web, which absolutely nobody could tell you what the that was supposed to be about. And now we have Kraven, which is based on the Spider-Man villain Kraven the Hunter, who, I mean, at least they finally found a character where it just kind of says who he is and what he does on the tin. His name's Kraven, and he's a hunter. He's got some nice animal powers. He's on a lone vigilante mission to kill the worst of international criminals, and none of y'all give a crap. And Sony knows none of you guys give a crap, because literally on the eve of this movie getting its previews this past Thursday, Sony literally announced that, yeah, sorry, I don't know what we were thinking. We're not doing this SSU franchise anymore. This was a really bad idea. And yeah, It was a bad idea. Look, I'm a movie snob, okay? I'll own it, and I'm glad that, having been of the age where this entire cycle of superhero fantasy movies started popping off when I was literally just getting into college, and where not just the films themselves, but the, actual conversations about them have dominated so much of not just the box office, but just film fandoms and discussions about films, where this stuff was basically been inescapable well into my 30s. And I'm not going to pretend that there aren't some superhero fantasy movies I like. I'm a real sicko. I really liked Man of Steel and the director's cut of Batman vs. Superman, okay? I know that makes me some kind of crazy person, but I also like, The Dark Knight and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and Ang Lee's Hulk. Nobody talks about Ang Lee's Hulk anymore. And the old school Richard Donner Superman. I even like the first Captain America quite a bit. I think it's cute. But where I become a movie snob is that as our present culture is clearly sinking into a level of what a lot of people are calling superhero or comic book movie fatigue, where, let's face it, people like me and my generational cohort, most of whom have never read a comic book that wasn't some prestige title assigned in a very specific liberal arts elective class, most of whom only got introduced to this grand pantheon of modern pop culture gods and demigods and heroes and heels, and only got super invested in it to the extent that it was clearly the hot thing for a minute. If you are an actual comic book person and you're still holding on to whatever granular breakdowns you have about why Marvel was such a success and why Sony's movies suck so much, where it's like, I don't even have to tell you how much Kraven sucks. You just kind of know instinctually that it sucks. I hope you and I can come together here, and as a movie snob to a comic book person, it's not just Sony. It's all of this shit. Again, I like some superhero movies, but I like them as standalone fantasy pictures. I like Darkman, I like The Rocketeer, I like X2. I definitely have a prejudice for a lot of stuff that I grew up with, just like you do. But at the end of the day, while I am going to do my best to not rant for too long and actually just give some basic constructive reasons why Kraven in particular is bad and sucks, I think that us movie snobs and our comic book people counterparts kind of need to come together and acknowledge that whatever each of us has gotten out of this renaissance in comic book and superhero fantasy movies in the last 2 decades, mutually and respectively for both our favored, cherished art forms, it's not just time to take old Yeller out back and shoot him. It's time to recognize that this dog was never a cute little puppy to begin with. This was not a relationship that was ever gonna work because, I'm sorry, superheroes don't work in movies. I know that that's an out-of-pocket statement that's going to get a lot of people saying I'm just rage farming for clicks, to which I'll respond, welcome to the algorithm. But at the same time, no, I'm dead serious. I think I finally figured something out, which is how it is that comic books, that superhero pantheons can be so full of all of these exciting, diverse, eccentric, weird, colorful, sometimes quite shocking characters with so much potential for storytelling, why it seems to be that historically the adaptation of those figures has been so problematic for filmmakers, both in terms of comic book fans just outright rejecting them, and in terms of a culture of film criticism, didn't even really give these sorts of films a fair day in court until basically Disney turned Marvel into the biggest juggernaut in fantasy films since Star Wars, and it was like, okay, we have to pay attention to this and acknowledge that a large portion of the audiences are not just passively consuming, but are genuinely resonating with this. Even then, it doesn't take long for guys like me to hop on the mic and just sort of take the mask off and say, okay, now that we're all ready to admit that every major studio putting out 2 or 3 of these comic book movies in a year is too much, I'm also just going to come out and say it. I don't care if you're a Marvel person. I don't care if you're a DC person. I don't care if you're a Sony person, though clearly Sony people don't exist, and it's a shame they don't exist because those freaks have got to be awesome in bed, right? If you're a Sony person, that's crazy. The point is that now that people are finally ready to admit, yeah, dog, I'm getting really sick of all these superhero movies. I could get Iron Man, I could get Guardians of the Galaxy, I could get Wonder Woman. I don't get whatever the Thunderbolts or Eternals is. Now that people are really talking like that, again, as the film snob talking more to the comic book person than anybody else, with everyone else kind of being our audience, my friend in Christ, the comic book person, I'm sorry, it wasn't a studio or a brand thing, it wasn't a fidelity to the source or a caring about the fans thing, it was the whole thing. It was the whole thing that was always like this, which is to say, it was mostly, all of it, always Madame Web and Morbius to me. You can go back and watch them. Guess what? The original Tim Story Fantastic Four movies, they aren't as bad as you remember them, and quite frankly, they are a lot more like what Disney's first two phases of Marvel movies would be than you would like to admit. By the same token, a lot of those early MCU movies, dog, they weren't that good. At the very least, they weren't that much better than the sorts of superhero fantasy movies we got before. They just weren't, I'm sorry. I'm not saying that there isn't a very interesting conversation to be had about the history of superheroes as a commodity for fantasy films, about the ways in which the development and production and marketing of these films has changed significantly over time, especially in terms of studios being willing to not so much court the comic book fandoms more, but to treat general audiences more like comic book fandoms and basically astroturf a new generation of comic book nerds who don't even read that many comic books. All of that stuff is interesting, and I'm not taking away from it or the very real effects it has on what you as a real comic book person get out of these movies that is different from my perspective. But at the end of the day, let's just be real with each other. These movies have always mostly been boring and sucked, with a handful of them being competently made enough to be just considered passable, and with a small minority of them being the sorts of things that you can point to and be like, you know what, that is great original filmmaking. That's not just watering down something you've adapted from a bunch of properties, throwing stuff at a wall to see what sticks. That's the mark of a true artist operating at the top of their game to give us something that you couldn't get from a comic book version of this character or concept or theme. The olive branch I'm extending in what is sure to be a way too long rant before I talk about Kraven in my usual extemporaneous style of talking around movies so much before getting into them, at least when I'm really hot under the collar about something. The olive branch I'm willing to extend to the real comic book heads out there is that y'all should be catching the comic book movie fatigue sooner than anybody, because you know deep down that this has not sucked as much as it has for this long because of fidelity to the source or because of respect for you as a fan. It's because adapting a serialized medium to the non-serialized medium of a major motion picture, before getting into whatever other cultural baggage or background details, by its very nature, is going to be a degeneration of the very thing that made not just the medium, but the very characters that flourished in that medium work so well within it. Do I even need to tell you that way too much of Kraven the Hunter is given over just to explaining the origin of this character? How he's the son of a ruthless Russian gangster, and while on a hunting expedition in Africa, he gets mauled by a vicious man-eating lion, only for the lion to spare him and his life to be saved by a special elixir from a voodoo priestess, after which he is granted exceptional agility, strength, and enhanced senses, as well as an ability to commune directly with animals, powers he then uses to strike back at the very people, like his father, who treat animals as well as human beings as mere objects of their power and dominion. Now, as a comic book person, I am already used to you guys saying, oh god, here we go again with the origin movie. We don't need to see the origin, just tell the story. But here's the thing, again, coming from me, the movie snob, the movie guy. You may not feel that the origin is that important, but that's because even if you haven't read a single comic with Kraven the Hunter in it, you've probably been all over the Wikipedia page and the forums enough so that you get the gist of his lore. But in movies, you can't really just show a cat lady or a Spider-Man or a fish guy and treat him like he's, I don't know, a lawyer or a firefighter. We're just dropping in media res to see where he's at and watch the story. These are weird, larger-than-life, eccentric, and colorful characters who, if you're making a movie about them, you kind of need to know that, even if, again, structurally it's not incorporated very well into the film. We do need the Kraven origin movie because nobody can relate to this motherfucker even in the way we might relate to an ancient gladiator or a talking teddy bear. There's no schematic reference point that I have for what this Kraven guy is. I gotta know something about where he's coming from, and in a way that's cinematically compelling. The problem is, though, that's still really boring. This is why so many of the most popular superhero movies of all time, not just among comic book people, but film people as well, Spider-Man 2, The Dark Knight, Batman Returns, X2. It's clear that what works in the film medium the best as far as comic book and superhero fantasy adaptations go are not the origin stories. They are the in media res stories that come right after. But I think the problem is something much more fundamental than that. And frankly, I think it's best illustrated by the fact that despite the fact that superhero fantasy movies are falling off, superhero shows are more popular than ever. Nobody has liked the last two phases of Marvel movies nearly as much as they've liked Loki, or Agatha, or Daredevil. Nobody gave nearly as much of a crap about Matt Reeves' The Batman as they have come crawling out of the woodwork being like, actually, you know what? You wouldn't think it, but The Penguin is a really good show. Nobody likes the Flash movie as much as the Flash TV shows. And nobody likes any of these movies as much as they love The Boys or Invincible. And I'll bet that if you are that comic book person, you never liked any of these movie adaptations nearly as much as the various animated TV series you grew up with, whether we're talking about X-Men, or Spider-Man, or Batman, or Superman. It's because these kinds of characters, these kinds of weird fiction-derived, eccentric, colorfully themed characters that flourished out of a very particular serialized medium, it turns out they don't really translate well to standalone 2-hour movies. They don't. Sure, you and I might both be on the same page where you're like, yeah, this Kraven the Hunter guy seems like a really interesting and underrated character with a lot of concepts and themes that could be explored in a movie, and it might be really cool to see this illustrated character brought to life on the big screen. But the moment I, as the movie guy, start telling you, okay, so this movie, if we're going to get in as much of this stuff that we want from this character and these themes and these big action set pieces, it's going to need to be at least 2 hours. That's the moment where you, as the comic book person, should be pulling back and being like, oh, what? Dog, I've read entire limited runs of this character in less time. My favorite adaptations of this stuff in bites last maybe a half hour to an hour. In fact, even with all this time you're giving this, with all the stuff we want to put in, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot and forcing yourself to water down a bunch of stuff that really should have the time to sit and breathe and let the audience get invested in it. And the typical Hollywood response for the better part of 3 decades now has been, okay, but don't worry, because we're going to make these films with the predicate that every one of them is setting the stage for all that stuff to be expanded upon or pay off in the sequel. And this is where the comic book people fall off and kind of take movie people too much for granted and be like, okay, that could work. I could get along with that. I suppose it's not that different than the serialized medium that I prefer. I'll go with you on this cinematic universe angle, which is where you guys really need more folks like me, more self-admitted movie snobs, to come in and be like, wait for a sequel? What is this, Ivan the Terrible? Bro, I'm not coming back to this theater in a year to see Kraven and Calypso Midnight Suns or whatever. I already spent 2 hours with this jackass and it didn't do anything for me. This doesn't work in a non-serialized medium. I may come back to see Sam Raimi direct a new Spider-Man back when his was hot. Shoot, I may even come back to see him do a Doctor Strange sequel, even when all of y'all comic book people know the first Doctor Strange was mid as But then you heard Sam Raimi was attached to the sequel, and y'all were like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe. I like Sam. He's goated, comic book movie royalty. Let's see what he can do with this mid. I may come back for a good actor like Ron Perlman as Hellboy or Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. For the same reason, all of you comic book people, even for all the mediocrity in your own favored medium, you will ride or die when you find out there's a certain character you vibe with being done by a writer or artist who you really like, because whether it's comic books or movies, it is the individual influence of artists operating at the height of their craft that keeps you coming back. So when we work our way back to something like Kraven, having already unpacked what it is about films as adaptations of a medium and a type of fantasy that only really flourishes and works best because of its serialized nature, what on earth is going to make me come back to see Kraven 2, or God forbid, how this connects with their Sinister Six plans or whatever? It's all just more origin shit. Because we got Calypso, the voodoo priestess, set up in this, we got the chameleon set up in this, but I don't give a shit about them any more than I give a shit about Kraven. Even the sequels end up just being more origin bullshit, and even the sequels to the sequels just end up being more origin bullshit. Nothing ever just begins and ends on a good thematic note like a movie should. And this doesn't just come down to Kraven itself being a poorly made movie, and I promise you Kraven is a poorly made movie. One of those movies that's so poorly made that at the very least you can say that its own sub-mediocrity makes it more interesting to marvel at than just your mediocre Marvel movies where, I don't know, because Guardians of the Galaxy was hot, now everything they do needs to be a broad comedy about a ragtag team of losers. Yeah, my is really going to be in the seats for Thunderbolts. Oh, look, they're making the inside joke about how Thunderbolts is a terrible title. If there's one thing that you hardcore base of comic book and superhero movie heads haven't been complaining about ever since that joke about bright yellow spandex in the first X-Men movie, it's not like they haven't been crowing about that exact sort of watered-down, cowardly bullshit for 30 goddamn years now. But it's not just that Kraven itself is poorly made in isolation. It's that what makes this one so bad speaks to just the tragically endemic flaw in every attempt at making a good superhero fantasy adaptation, which is quite simply that at a baseline, everything needs to start off on this foot of just trying so desperately to persuade your mainstream audience that these characters are worth your time waiting for what's gonna happen next, juggling all these different plates when, look, we've already seen it. The best way to do that, adaptation-wise, is to hew not so much to the content of the comics, but to what makes comics as a medium work, which is to say, play into the colorful eccentricity of it, but track the story out in a serialized fashion where the expectations of the audience are calibrated to this villain of the week formula where, without a bunch of circumstance or exposition, we just get to see weird people do extraordinary things in a highly embellished context in the form of quick, easily digestible adventures and vignettes. I have a friend who really likes Hellboy, for instance. Shout out to Lauren, who I warned this new review was just going to be an epic rant more than anything else. She quite enjoys the Hellboy movie. She even had some positive stuff to say about that recent Crooked Man adaptation that nobody saw. But even she is like, I don't understand why it's so hard to make a version of this character that's true to the comics. And it's because, Lauren, babe, my sister in Christ, it's because movies aren't good for Hellboy. Even with an actor I love, with a director I highly respect, a director who could not have been more perfect for the subject, somebody operating not just out of his uncommon love for all things weird fiction, but at the top of his craft as a fantasy filmmaker, even his output is ultimately just kind of mid because it's like, why am I sitting in this chair for over 2 hours having these nerds trying to desperately convince me that Hellboy and this world are worth sitting with, when I could just read a comic book for a half hour and get way more out of just that? Hellboy would be perfect for like an animated series a la the classic HBO Spawn adaptation, and Ron Perlman is still the perfect voice for that character. But when you watch the movies, there's always going to be this part of your brain, no matter how competently the movie is made, that just sees this guy and all this prosthetics and makeup and sees the setup for all of this stuff that literally needs so much more than a single feature-length film to give you. And there's always going to be part of you that's just like, whatever, I'm tapping out, I don't care anymore, this isn't Hellboy, it's just some goofy motherfuckers in makeup parading around, but none of it pays off because it can't, because everything is always promising to go somewhere that the film can't take us immediately, and if the movie doesn't fare well at the box office, it's never going to pay off anyway, and we're going to be right back where we started. With Kraven, though, we're so far downstream of that because it's like, I audibly groaned once I, as a non-comic book person, realized that they were setting up Kraven's half-brother Dimitri to be the villain Chameleon, mainly through just constantly having different characters say, ooh, he's so good at mimicking voices and blending into the background, he's like a chameleon. And it's just like, I know this stuff is canon to the comics, but I don't care. I don't care about Chameleon or Calypso or the Foreigner or whatever I'm saying right now that's making all the non-comic book people and all the non-movie people and all the movie snobs roll eyes all the way over in the back of their heads because I thought I was getting a movie about a guy named Kraven the Hunter, not a bunch of ancillary stringers who you could slot in or out with any other C or D list comic characters and get exactly the same results for how much they matter to the narrative, all just to set us up for this longer epic saga that I already know genetically that I am not invested in returning to because it's too much of a value input. If I'm going to see a movie, whether it's the Burton Batmans or the Donner Superman or the Raimi Spider-Mans, I want to see a concise story about eccentric and weird characters who are fully defined within the confines of those 2 hours. If I wanted to follow an epic saga of ensemble animal-themed perverts, I'd be reading comic books right now. I'm watching a movie. Just give me a movie, please. It really is ironic because for the vast majority of the history of film and television adaptations of comic book and superhero fantasies, what has consistently upset the hardcore base of actual comic book readers and fans the most is their very accurate assessment of the film industry, having to play to a far more mainstream audience, being convinced that in order to get a mainstream audience to buy into such an adaptation, you had to get away from the source as much as possible, because otherwise it would come off as too fringe and nerdy and weird. This is why in the 60s and 70s, all adaptations of comic book superheroes were these high camp classics that, for as unpopular as they were among hardcore fans back then, they have had a resurgence of popularity today because it turns out it's actually kind of refreshing to go back and watch those old Incredible Hulk and Wonder Woman episodes and just see some cheapo B-TV nonsense where yet another drug dealer gets his comeuppance without a lot of strained gravitas or over-exposited ceremony to just try to get us into these characters. Again, the serialized medium is the best medium for this kind of character. This is also why, through the 80s and 90s, almost every superhero or comic book adaptation was channeled through the filter of alternative metal and industrial and goth rock soundtracks and was oriented around this style of dark urban fantasy, to such an extent that even Mystery Men, one of the all-time best superhero movies, was literally a straight-up parody of that aesthetic that Tim Burton kicked off with Batman 10 years earlier. It's also why, during that same period, ironically, studios were more likely to pick up more B or C-list characters like Spawn or Blade or Crow or even Steel for an adaptation, because they were convinced that the most lucrative characters for a mainstream audiences, besides the most iconic ones, the ones best positioned to take that kind of risk were the ones that audiences were the least familiar with, so that those characters weren't carrying the baggage of, being nerd. And the final irony, especially in the context of Sony's aborted SSU Rogues universe or whatever, basically we have been going so long, wasting so much time and money, been so oversaturated by this garbage in which these characters are being adapted into exactly the medium they work the least well within, that we've come full circle to most superhero movies, despite being more faithful to the content of those sources, despite pandering more overtly to trying to astroturf mainstream audiences into acting like comic book fans. We have come full circle to them just throwing whatever shit at a wall to see what sticks in the most watered down, neutered, affectless, and derivative way possible, where what we're mostly getting now is just these C and D list losers who could honestly make for way more interesting adaptations because so few people are familiar with them. But where they are still held back by just an endemic failure to recognize what makes the feature film medium actually hold these types of characters back. You want me to tell on myself for a bit? You want me to ruin my movie snob credentials for you right off the bat as long as we're going this long with this rant review? I was actually genuinely excited for Kraven. I thought the trailers for it made it look pretty good. I legitimately thought, you know what? Yeah, this looks like an interesting character. This looks like the right way to do it. I'm optimistic that this could be a dark horse superhero fantasy movie that, not unlike The Crow from this year, for whatever its flaws might be, actually turns out to be an interesting, self-contained story with enough unique stuff going for it that it might ironically turn out to be leagues better than the more A-listed tentpoles from bigger studios this year. But you know where I f***ed up? You know where I shot myself in the foot setting my expectations up like that? Because I was thinking like a movie snob. I was thinking like a person who likes self-contained, character-driven stories, and not in terms of the endemic limitations of superhero fantasy adaptations, but also just the criminal levels of absence in creative leadership that makes so many of these movies, even at their most competent, so hollow and boring and such a chore to even bother engaging with. Kraven is an interesting character. He does have an interesting backstory. He is a colorful, eccentric, and the rare supernatural superhero, a nice change of pace from the more science fantasy variety of mutants and mad science creations and alien heroes we get a lot of recently. And more importantly, he as a character is part of a really diverse and textured tradition of even older, larger-than-life heroes and classics in adventure and weird fiction, whether we're talking about Alan Quatermain or Tarzan or Doc Savage. There are so many places you could go with this character that, in their own self-contained way, could be really atmospheric or even poetic, and maybe even do what's so hot with Hollywood liberals, which is find a way to sort of oppositionally frame Kraven within the racist and patriarchal history of that sort of character. Maybe. I don't read a lot of comic books. I haven't read a single comic book with Kraven the Hunter in it. But you can put this image in front of my face and give me the gist of who this character is, his background, and I could have a lot of fun writing a weird, evocative adventure just out of the image. That's another thing that comic books are supposed to be able to do. They're supposed to be able to be larger than life through limited means. And when you try to directly translate that context into a feature film, you're combining the failure of taking something that is too insubstantial and stretching it too thinly over too long a runtime, but also that runtime isn't nearly enough to give you the same thrill that you can get out of a serialized medium, where each episode ends at a very specific point that leaves you going, ooh, I wonder what's going to happen next, as opposed to watching the movie where it's like, okay, yeah, there's no episode break. We're just going from this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then the credits roll, and now a mid-credits scene is going to happen, and we're going to be told that more stuff is going to happen with more people we don't give a about. Of course, nobody in Hollywood is tailoring these movies after what they can most get out of them, which is what is evocative on the page, in that image. They are tailoring what they do after what has already worked, or increasingly, stuff that they know doesn't work at all, but they're gonna keep driving at it anyway because there's a vacuum of creative leadership, and nobody has the balls to, in their pitch, to just tell Sony, look, if this is going to work, if it even has a chance of appealing to a mainstream audience, you're going to have to throw all this other bullshit to the side and just make this a story about a supernatural hunter who hunts down bad guys. That's it. That's the part that's cool. We can keep a lot of the eccentric details, but we have to start at the isolated character and story level first, because there's no point in doing this if you expect people who don't know who Kraven is to be ride or die about him in the context of this rogues gallery universe you're doing, filled with a bunch of other characters who you don't have time to explore, and that also nobody gives a shit about either and has no reason to. I mean, nobody in the mainstream public is rude enough to write it off as nerd shit anymore. Everyone's a nerd now and has been for 20 years because now the affectations of being nerdy are seen as mainstream and cool. But deep down, we all really know that it's still nerd shit, that we were ironically better off when you tried making movies with the understanding that we are working with a handicap, not with the love of the masses. Which we also don't have anymore because, again, it's not even because it's nerd shit anymore. It's because the value input is too much. It's exhausting and boring. If you want this to work, you need to just get back to telling pared down, contained stories for regular people. But just as in the comics are nerd generation, in the comics are mainstream cool generation, Hollywood is filled with people with an overabundance of confidence in their ability to know what audiences want out of movies, as well as hacky yes men who are, for whatever they say about what draws them to a character or a theme, are going to be more focused on building up their resume in a climate where you have to do these types of movies to stay at the top of a viable career. And so to direct Kraven the Hunter, an action-adventure fantasy about a supernatural animal man who hunts down and kills the world's most vicious and violent criminals, we have J.C. Chandor, an American director coming out of Somerset County, New Jersey. Rebel, Jersey represent. I'm about to roast the hell out of you, J.C., but we always take a moment to recognize our Middle Jersey brethren. This guy, J.C. Chandor, whose resume of action and fantasy movie experience includes the 2011 drama Margin Call about the 2008 financial crisis, followed by All Is Lost, a practically minimalist survival drama, followed by the 2014 crime drama A Most Violent Year, followed by, an action movie, Triple Frontier. Okay, so he's not completely green. This isn't a situation where I'm, like, looking up the director of Twisters and being like, why did they get an indie drama guy to do a big budget special effects disaster movie? Now, I haven't seen Chandor's first and last action movie before Kraven, but man, if Kraven is any indication of his merits, folks, I am confident the reason Sony turbo nuked their Spider-Man universe plans was not just because of the financial disappointment of the last two films. It wasn't just because they saw how unpopular the Kraven panel was at whatever convention. It was because they saw the final cut of the movie. They saw what $130 million bought them for a big holiday season release, and they said, this is terrible. Not just dramatically it's terrible, not just that the attempts at humor are strained and unfunny, but just like as an action movie, this makes us look bad. This makes us look like we don't know what we're doing. It makes it look like we can't even deliver a competent product. We need to stop what we're doing and regroup and maybe even put some heads in the guillotine because this shit looks like ass. We are talking one after another of action scenes that hardly ever have any visceral punch or impact, where the choreography is unoriginal and not shot in such a way that we really feel the hits and observe the movements, where Chandor is even doing like cheap where he's cutting on action between different takes of the same shot setup, as in the shot itself doesn't change, but there's a very clear cut between actions so you know it's two different takes. That's how amateurish and cheap and rushed this movie looks. There's this one action set piece in particular where Kraven is taking out a bunch of mercenary goons who are raiding the woods around his home, and it's not just that it's boring and derivative, it's that Chandor can't even seem to, give us a compelling sense of continuity, or he doesn't seem particularly invested in the perspectives of these mercenaries who, if what Kraven is doing is going to hit, maybe stick with these red shirts for a bit, really show them stalking, really show them in this reactive atmosphere of dread, really play up that sense of this uneven playing field so that when these kills do happen, there's been suspense foreshadowing it. It's not just what the sequence is, which is just Chandor cutting back and forth between the villains saying some bullshit about, oh, I knew these guys weren't going to cut it. And then these practically miscellaneous, indistinct scenes of Kraven just dispatching nameless goons with no sense of where we are or how we got there or how he got there. It's literally just hits, but no following of the action. But even here, this whole sequence is really just a microcosm of the fundamental story failure of Kraven, which is where I ask, why in this movie about a character whose whole MO is that he's a ruthless, savage, highly skilled, supernatural hunter whose prey is the most dangerous game of all? Man, why in this movie about this character are we not opening with a long, atmospheric, drawn-out sequence of these elite mercenaries roaming through the wild, looking for their target, but then slowly and gorily getting picked off one by one until we finally rest on the dark visage of Kraven the Hunter. Bang! Opening titles. Ooh, are we talking about atmosphere and making a character interesting? Are we talking about subverting the audience's expectations, at least for a little bit, just so we could maybe set a mood where they're like, okay, where are we? Are these the guys we're following now? Are they the protagonists? Is one of them gonna be Kraven? Only for us to be like, oh no, these are the bad guys. Oh my God, this guy just got cold-blooded gutted them all. He's the hero? Oh shit, this guy's a badass. You know what a great reference point for a Kraven movie would have been? Predator! And Predator 2 for the urban sequences. I know Dan Trachtenberg has been busy making actual Predator movies, but I'm sure he knows some people who are better at directing straight R-rated action than the all is lost guy. But again, we return to the point of stuff just not working and the increasing vacuum of creative leadership to even realize that, to do this sort of story justice, you don't just cynically farm the superficial content of comic books and plant them in a medium where that crop doesn't flourish. You need to start from the perspective of, okay, what is the most evocative cinematically? What are our cinematic reference points here? What are gritty stories about men being hunted like animals? Oh, okay, Predator could definitely work. Definitely the most dangerous game. That one's obvious. Maybe because of the Russian mob angle. Maybe even David Cronenberg with Eastern Promises. That could be a great setup for a Kraven fight. Maybe he's in a Russian bathhouse and he's just bare naked fighting all these guys. That would get the most out of that R rating. People would get up on that. People would be running riot out of the theater. Are you kidding me? Aaron Taylor Johnson going full nude and doming and gutting and killing all these Russian gangsters. It really is a sad but revelatory world in which Jessica Lawrence in a romantic comedy had more balls to do something as daring as do a full frontal nude fight scene in homage to a David Cronenberg movie, clearly, than the actual f***ing R-rated vigilante movie. That's how small your balls are. Jennifer Lawrence has way huger balls than you. She's way more serious. In fact, You should just give her a superhero movie. We can all tell she's really, really a good actor. What's crazy is that this is a movie called Kraven the Hunter, where this guy is constantly being built up without any sense of mystery or atmosphere, because we never leave Aaron Taylor Johnson's milquetoast visage for more than a couple minutes in this movie about a guy called the Hunter. He barely does any hunting. There's a part where he kills a bunch of poachers where it's like, content-wise, okay, great, that's good character-based stuff. That's what our guy should be doing. Killing poachers, taking his animal powers and sense of morality and turning it on the people who exploit the most vulnerable, especially those poor, exotic, beautiful animals. But he never hunts the poachers in this movie. He literally sees a bunch of poachers driving along and then just stands in the middle of the road waiting for them. That's not hunting! Since we don't get that cold open of Kraven the Hunter actually hunting bad guys, do you know how this movie opens? It opens with Kraven the Hunter sneaking into a Russian prison to kill a gangster boss. Ugh. This movie is so terrible, they're even calling the police out. They're gonna come get me. They're afraid I'm gonna pull a Luigi Mangione on the makers of this goddamn movie. That's parody, though. That's not an actionable threat. I'm just really f***ed up here, folks. This movie was so bad. Because it's like, my man, besides not being important to the plot, this gangster boss isn't being hunted. He already was hunted. And caught. He's in prison. He's literally a caged animal. This is symbolically like the equivalent of seeing that, I don't know, actual hunters have already caught a badger alive and it's in a cage. And some random conventionally hot guy just walks up to the cage and stabs the badger through the bar. And that's supposed to be how we're introduced to this cool, evocative anti-hero. Pussy nerd shit. And it's not enough that Kraven doesn't get to be presented in the thematically appropriate way. It's that despite this being supposedly Sony's attempt at a really different kind of universe where we're finally getting into the hard R of the comic book rogues gallery, where we get the more visceral, explicit violence, Kraven still needs to be like this even-keeled, cool, identifiable, nice, handsome guy who's really cool to his brother, who never makes an overt pass at a woman, as beautiful as Ariana DeBose playing Calypso here, who the weirdest thing he does is go fishing in a river with his bare hands, which any survivalist or indigenous person will tell you, you can do that without superpowers. That is a real skill. You don't need offensively stereotyped black girl magic to do that. And sure, he eats some salmon raw because, you know, he's an animal man. But then he just comes back to his big family home with this very hip, environmentally conscious geodesic window design, and he just, oh, he's so exhausted. He just plops down on his bed, and it's like, Why is Kraven the Hunter being framed like he's just another eligible bachelor in a long line of inoffensive, even-keeled white guys? This is a hard R movie about a supernatural hunter who hunts gangsters, and he has less prickly edges than Star-Lord and Ant-Man. This is not just a bad movie made in a vacuum of creative leadership. It's not just a movie with bad action and a terrible judge of thematic cohesion. It is fundamentally a movie that completely abdicates doing anything even remotely original and weird when presented with the perfect opportunity to do it. I am, as a movie snob, already of the opinion that unless it is explicitly a comedy like Deadpool or some kind of satiric context like The Boys, an R-rated superhero is already insulting to the intelligence. Superheroes are already juvenile stuff. I have no excuse going into Kraven the Hunter and expecting that I'm going to get something mature. I get it. I own that. I'm sorry. But even as juvenile trash for infantilized adults like me, it speaks volumes that Kraven is as utterly toothless as it is. Especially in terms of the one thing that you should be able to carry off in an R-rated superhero movie. The one thing that would make all of the mediocrity kind of worth it, which is that As far as my self-awareness of the inherently juvenile and trashy nature of it all, the one thing that would make even the trashiness of it work, why doesn't anyone fuck in this movie? And I am trying to be incredibly diligent about not offending DeBose as an actress, especially a black actress in this context. Our women actors deserve better than to be just shallow sex objects. Let me be clear. Shout out to R.S. Benedict's now immortal essay, "Everyone is beautiful and no one is horny." But for real, what is the point of sending this vanilla milquetoast, boring-ass white boy to the gym to look like he does, to get these lazy cheesecake shirtless shots that Chandor gives us in a long line of utterly failed attempts to seem self-aware and campy? What is the point of putting this dude opposite a woman as phenomenally, absolutely gorgeous as Ariana DeBose, and for them to not just give in to their animal instincts? Johnson is clearly struggling so hard to play a nice guy. In the scene where he meets DeBose and tries to recruit her to help him, you can see my man straining so hard because he has no idea what the line of his motivation is supposed to be. He has no clue if he's just supposed to be being nice or instrumental, or how far he's supposed to be going in indicating, oh yeah, I am kind of flirting with this woman because why wouldn't I? I'm Kraven the Animal Man. I know what these pheromones she's exuding means. It's mating season in the concrete jungle. And at a certain point, even if I qualify all this and say, yes, Ariana DeBose deserves better than to just be a beautiful woman who gets buck wild in some dumb D-list superhero's bedroom, even with that qualification, isn't it kind of offensive in its own way to, give the impression that Kraven is just too cool and aloof as a guy to recognize and act like, hey, this is an extra level of beautiful woman. This is not, even if we don't do anything, this should be kind of tough on me. And yeah, you want to foreground that Calypso isn't just eye candy, that she's independent and smart and confident and whatever, but that just makes her sexier. I'm sorry. Smart, independent, confident women are sexy, especially when they are conventional Hollywood hot. Why would they not fuck at any point when they have multiple opportunities and they are clearly attractive and attracted to each other? Why in this R-rated comic book movie are full-grown adults still not able to just do what full-grown adults do when they like each other and think they're both hot? Of everybody working on this movie, nobody has done a better job than the costume department for DeBose. They tell a whole narrative with just her costuming better than anything that Chandor does with all of his strained attempts at animal theming and occult symbolism. And yes, in addition to it all, Kraven the Hunter also somehow finds the nerve to be kind of pretentious. Our girl Calypso gets a whole narrative story with just her costume. She goes from formal to business formal, to business casual, to straight casual, until by the penultimate action scene I was talking about, the one that should have come first in the story, at that point she is just straight up, all the way just... Look, I'm sorry, I haven't had this much trouble talking about a woman in a movie since Caddy O'Brien in Love Lies Bleeding. DeBose was... And the story that her costume was telling was clearly of someone who is becoming progressively more and more comfortable and open to this weird, violent beast man who turns out to have this really sensitive, soft side, just like so many wild beasts and men do. And I know I'm getting really out of pocket at this point in a way that a lot of y'all probably weren't guessing. This is already a really long video, but I'm going to keep pulling on this thread because the way I deal with bad movies is by finding ways to make myself feel like my time wasn't wasted by really exercising my critical thinking or just going completely froggy with it. Yeah, there's discourse here. There's hella discourse about not just how interracial relationships, scare quotes, are depicted in films in general, but specifically whether we're talking about Kiersey Clemons in The Flash, or we're talking about Zendaya in the MCU Spider-Mans, or we're talking about Zoe Saldana in the Guardians of the Galaxy, or FKA Twigs in The Crow, where, at least, thank God, at least they a lot in this trashy R-rated comic book movie. Or we're talking in a more subversive sense about Zazie Beetz and Joker. There is clearly a trend happening right now of casting black women as the ingenues of white boys in comic book movies, but Kraven is sort of just revealing the most extreme case about how they're trying to do this to a black woman in superhero movies, but not just admit that that's what they're doing by just, even after 2 Black Panthers, just make black women hot new ornaments in the wardrobe of white guy heroes, and more especially not just white guys, but white guys who are clearly kind of ups and losers in a state of arrested adolescence. But at least Zendaya and Tom Holland get to show actual teenage intimacy in the Spider-Man movies. At least Gamora is actually one of the core Guardians team members who does some shit. At least Joker actually seemed to be quite prescient about framing the sort of white loner's limerence for a black woman specifically as the problematic, racistly coded thing that it is. And FKA Twigs, you know, at least she gets to be a weird little goth chick who likes to again, I will die on a hill for the crow. It's not a great movie by any means, but it is accidentally like the best superhero fantasy movie in years, and a big part of that is because we actually get to see adults. That's really what it comes down to. And the soundtrack goes off. In this case of Kraven with the Calypso character that DeBose plays, she is literally the most ornamentalized out of all the black women in this pattern so far, because any actual physical intimacy is apparently too far for an R-rated vigilante movie. And you know what's up? I bet if you asked Chandor or Johnson, they could probably justify just how thankless and racist and sexist her part is with a slick, lazy, liberal appropriation of the language of feminism and intersectionality and social justice. But, okay, white boys in Hollywood and all over who clearly have a thing for black women, I need to holler at you for a minute. And I don't mean holla, I mean holler with the hard R. I'm going to holler at my fellow white straight men with the hard R. I know that's a serious thing to do. I don't drop the hard R lightly, but I can't holla. That's not something I can do. I have to holler at you right now. I'm not saying we can't make movies about how it hits different. I'm saying not so many of them need to be the juvenile comic book movies. And if they are going to be the juvenile comic book movies, I'm sorry, they gotta do something. They can't just stand around each other and look pretty. You got to show less chastity than Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, because that's where the R-rated Kraven the Hunter is. It is less boundary pushing than a movie that came out in the late 60s in which you don't even see the on-screen interracial couple kiss. DeBose could have been much better served, this Calypso character could have been much better served in a movie that wasn't endemically held back by a bunch of pussy nerd shit. Kraven the Hunter is the sort of comic book movie that is so bad that it kind of just sucks all other superhero fantasy movies in like a black hole. It's the sort of movie that'll have you reevaluating the last 30 years of commercial cinema and being like, dear God in heaven, what have we done? This is a movie so toothless and whack and without imagination or edge. But at the same time, in the final moments, Chandor and the screenwriters reveal their pretensions again and have the temerity to leave us on the cliffhanger of like, oh, now what were merely the dark subaltern motivations buried deep in Kraven's subconscious, now they might be on the verge of coming out and him transforming into a more awful and violent and brutal figure. And it's like, what are you talking about? You just wasted 2 hours of my life giving me this basic guy who, despite his name, never really hunts. The most edgy stuff he does is, frankly, just comes off as showboaty and cowardly. But even right down to his libido, my man can't even touch a woman he's clearly attracted to because implicitly he, like you, the filmmakers, is too afraid of how you might come off to some people to be edgy. And now you want to tell me, oh, but just wait for the sequel. Our man's gonna be hella edgy and conflicted then. F*** off. Okay. Okay, I think I'm ready to wrap this up. But I'm a guy who likes to live on the edge, and again, the reason I'll devote this much time to a movie I disliked, and specifically won't to a movie that I really liked, is because I think of film criticism as both a tool for highlighting things that you think are exceptional, but also as a way to make yourself feel like your time isn't wasted, that you get something out of even the worst things you see. Plus, a final compliment before we sign off. We got our man Russell Crowe turning in an absolutely perfect character performance as Kraven's evil Russian gangster father. I personally love what Crowe's been doing in terms of his career recently. I love that he's clearly so comfortably and happily moving into his late-in-life character actor phase. Even in a lot of worse movies he's in, he's giving great scene-chewing performances, and Kraven is no different. And any moment Crowe is on screen, it both elevates his fellow performers, at least at times, but it also basically confirms a lot of the basic failures of this production, of how even when Chandor is clearly trying to go for a sense of camp, that it's not enough to match someone like Crowe's utterly effortless ability to take something absurd, play it totally straight, and thus make it that much more entertaining and funny. Superhero fantasy movies aren't just exhausting now because of certain endemic factors, but because of evolving ones. Even superhero movies that try to be more on the funny and campy side can't help but come off with this sense of jaded aloofness that clearly signifies that the art we've lost most crucially is the ability to use these characters to generate a kind of evocative, weird fantasy atmosphere where more than just campiness, you like them precisely because of their strange eccentricities of concept. And for a production so shoddy that it is functionally a really expensive B-movie, nobody is bringing that sort of comfortable, weird B-movie energy like Crowe in this. My man can chew the scenery. My man can steal a shot where the focus is supposed to be Johnson himself, because even just a look that Crowe is giving in the background is devouring the scene here. And I've got to give credit where credit is due. In fact, Crowe might be just enough to take this bad movie and make it at least qualify for a 2 out of 5. With that, I'm finally going to sign off. My sinuses are dry as the Sahara now. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time. Oh, no. Oh, thank God.